Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar for Community Project Funding Grantees regarding forms and submissions. I'm Randall Mullen with TDA Consulting, and I will further introduce myself and the co-presenter momentarily. Before we begin presenting the content, I first want to cover a few logistics. If you've participated in prior webinars related to the CPF program, you probably know this detail. All participants will be muted during the webinar, so you'll be able to participate only in listen mode. The PowerPoint presentation either has been or will be available to you as participants. The slide deck will also be on the HUD Exchange soon after this webinar. You'll find the slides on the recently launched CPF landing page shown here. Although you will participate in listen mode, we want you to be actively engaged in the webinar. You may submit content-related questions related to this topic using the chat feature in Zoom. Sending those questions, please, to everyone, not just us presenters. And the co-presenter and I will monitor the chat and answer clarifying questions when possible as they are asked during the presentations. We will also pause at the end of each section of today's webinar, read aloud those frequently asked questions, and orally answer them for all to hear. As in the prior webinars, we've reserved time for a Q&A period toward the end of the presentation, where we'll invite HUD representatives to answer the more difficult questions or clarify what we presenters provided in earlier responses as necessary. Here's the agenda that will follow today. As I mentioned, it will begin with introductions, followed by a brief review of the prior cohort webinar topics. And then we'll begin our presentation on forms and submission. After we cover those agenda items, we'll have a final Q&A period and identify resources that we would urge you to obtain at the HUD Exchange for further guidance in preparing the forms and submission of your grant materials to HUD. And lastly, we'll invite you to complete an evaluation either before you log off or immediately afterwards. Now I'll begin the introductions and then tag my co-presenter, who will introduce herself, and she will in turn tag two HUD representatives who are joining us today. Again, my name is Randall Mullen, and I'm with TDA Consulting, where I've worked for many years as both vice president and as a senior consultant on a wide range of housing and community development projects. I recently assisted HUD in explaining guidance around congressional appropriations. That work has included both recovery from natural disasters and response to the COVID-19 pandemic, plus recovery from its associated impacts, and now the CPF program. The co-presenter today is Jennifer Alpha. Jennifer, will you please introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Jennifer Alpha. I'm a senior consultant with TDA. I work on a range of HUD programs, including CPF, of course, also Home, CDBG, NSP, CDBGDR, and others. My former career was as an attorney, so I'm particularly excited about a good form. So I'm excited to help present this particular session of the cohort series. And with that, I will turn it over to Connor at HUD.
Hey everyone, my name is Connor LaRoe. I'm a program analyst with the Congressional Grants Division, primarily working on the provision of the technical assistance resources like these cohort sessions. And I also work as a systems officer supporting the grantee portfolios of many of the grant officers. I did want to turn it over to some of the other HUD reps that are on today. I believe we were supposed to have Portia on, but I don't see her on. But if there are any other HUD grant officers on, please feel free to unmute and introduce yourself.
Are there any other HUD representatives? Okay, hearing none, Connor, we will definitely rely upon you as a capable sole representative of the department. The CPF cohort is assembled for you to receive specific guidance that will assist you in the satisfactory completion of all grant materials. You were invited to join this cohort based on your award of a fiscal year 23 CPF grant. To facilitate support of this cohort, you were enrolled in a learning management system called Absorb, which is hosted by TDA Consulting. Previous sessions were held on the dates indicated here and covered requirements for submission of grant materials beginning with project narrative, what must be described in a full project description. Budget, how to itemize not only the planned uses of your grant, but also identify sources of funding for the entire project, and environmental review, when and how to assess the impacts of your project on the environment and vice versa. Today's session 4 on forms and submissions will specifically assist you in completion and submission of all the required forms and related content necessary to enter into a grant agreement and then start your community's project. To obtain valuable resources and the prior webinar slides, check out the new CPF program landing page. If you haven't, sign up at the HUD Exchange listserv to obtain updates. And should you have already signed up, be sure to add the CPF program to your notifications. That way you'll be notified about new information that is posted to the HUD Exchange. I'd like for Jennifer now to actually drop into the chat the link for the listserv, and I'm going to share with you a page that depicts the landing page and one particular detail that we think is important for you to take into consideration. If you use the link that Jennifer just provided to you, you will be taken to this page of the HUD Exchange, which is where you would initially subscribe to HUD Exchange mailing lists or add to your list. And you might think I'll find that the CPF program toward the very top, as these appear to be in alphabetical order, and they are. But note that the CPF community project funding grants are actually a part of HUD's longstanding Economic Development Initiative program, referred to as the EDI program. So you'll check off EDI-CPF for community project funding grants. And that's how you will obtain the necessary information from the department in regard to your grants. Now we'll go back to the presentation and continue with the next slide. What specifically will the forms topic cover, and how will Jennifer and I address it? Well, once again, we'll explain the guidance based on the FY23 CPF grant guide, just like we did for grant materials on narrative, budget, and environmental review. The required forms for submission of your grant packet are described in the attachments to the grant guide. Jennifer and I will detail the key forms and instructions, particularly beginning with the standard form 424, or the application for federal assistance. And then we'll cover other required forms and wrap up with the grantee submission checklist. But first, it's time for a poll, and I'd like for Jennifer to help with it. And we actually have a question of about where you are in the submission process, as well as a related follow-up question. I'll show you the first question, and then she's going to launch the poll for this one, and we'll come back to the follow-up question after we obtain your response. Take it away, Jennifer.
Okay, thank you all. So the first question we have for you is, have you begun to complete the forms for your CPF submission? So this will help us understand whether you've already taken a look at the forms and have a basic understanding of what they're about, or if this is new content for you. If you've already started to complete them, perhaps you already have some questions for us.
Right.
And that will be great because you can drop them in the chat. So we've got, we'll have some answers rolling in. Looks like it's slowing down. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll in just a second. Okay, and it looks like about 70% of folks have not started.
Interesting.
So a lot of folks who this will maybe new content for them. Thank you for
Yeah.
completing that poll. That's helpful for us to understand.
And then we have a follow-up question this time, right, Jennifer?
We do, yeah. So one other question we wanted to ask today. So let me go back here. I need to stop sharing these results. So for this poll, take a look at your screen. It'll pop up there. We're asking, when do you expect to submit your grant materials? Do you think it'll be within 2 weeks? You know, this is the last of our formal cohort sessions. We will have an office hours session still remaining. But other than that, we're about at the end of the cohort series. So folks should be pretty close to submitting. We're hopeful. So we'd like to hear from you about what your intentions are for your submission within 2 weeks, within a month, within 2 months, within 3 months, or later than 3 months. We'll give folks some time to complete the answers. I think that may be everyone. All right, I'm gonna close the poll in just a second. If you still want to answer, there's time. All right, gonna end the poll, share the results. So it looks like the majority, it's kind of a fairly evenly broken out
Yes.
between the between 2
is.
weeks and 3 months, but looks around, you know, most people are looking, the greatest number are looking around 3 months or within a month. So that is good for us to know, good for HUD to know, so that they know what kind of volume may be coming in. But this does look like a fairly even distribution across these timeframes here. And for those of you who are looking out a little longer for your submission, if there is anything that you need assistance with, or you have questions that need to be answered before you can make that submission, please feel free to use the time during these sessions to ask for that assistance. And we'll talk
Indeed.
more later about resources that can assist you after the cohort series ends. All right. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the poll. All right.
Okay, as I mentioned, the key forms will begin with the standard form 424, or the application for federal assistance. The SF 424, it's the common application for an organization to receive federal funding from either the Department of HUD or other departments. It provides basic information about your organization as a grantee, which requests those funds made available by special appropriation, in this case, from the Congress. As such, your organization is viewed as an applicant, and you must carefully identify and describe that organization along with the planned community project and its funding source. How can you obtain the SF 424 application for federal assistance? Well, first, we urge you to refer to the FY23 CPF grant guide and turn to page 11, as shown here. I will demonstrate where you can use the link in the first paragraph to eventually cause your computer to then go to, from the HUD webpage to particularly HUD to grants.gov, and you'll follow the steps that appear on this slide, identifying first pulling down the menu for forms, then the SF 424 family, and then the application for federal assistance. So I'm now going to demonstrate for you that particular web page and share my computer where it has navigated to grants.gov. What you see here is the grants.gov page that the HUD link would take you to. And this is the landing page for all of federal grants. And consequently, you would look along the top menu bar to forms and pull down on forms and select SF 424 family. Now, I realize that's a bit confusing because it's using that term in respect to a grouping of federal grants, not necessarily who is going to benefit from those federal grants. And as such, you see in where I have earlier navigated to that forms repository over here on the left side, the SF 424 family forms are shown below. And I've already caused this first column to be in alphabetical order. You can click on the agency's name.
Hey, Randall, I'm sorry, we're not seeing the
Oh,
the
I'm
web
sorry.
page. We're still
Okay,
seeing the slide.
let me try that again. Okay, how about now?
No, still not seeing it.
Now?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Okay, sorry about that. I chose to use Safari on a new computer, and I think maybe Zoom much prefers Google. Anyhow, this is the landing page, and then I have suggested that you pull down on that forms menu to SF424 family, which will then take you to this page, and you'll see this is where the SF424 family forms are. Remember, that's a grouping of grant forms, and you want to order the listing in the first column here, so it's in alphabetical order. And then this is where you would select the application for federal assistance, and you can download both, as I'll show you, the PDF file as well as the instructions. But it's important to note here that you would use those instructions in conjunction with the specific instructions that are available to you at the CPF grant guide. And so now I'm actually going to, go back to the presentation and share with you, how you would utilize that set of instructions in conjunction with the guidance from the CPF grant guide. As this slide, and I just like to double check, it does appear that the computer has gone back to the PowerPoint presentation. You would download that PDF file that I just noted. as well as the instructions, but you would note the specific instructions at the CPF grant guide on page, which actually continue onto page 12. And I will point out to you, Jennifer and I both noted this as well, that your computer's browser settings might not permit you to download the file, in which case you would need to grant permissions, but you want to be able to then not only download the files to your computer, but open them in Adobe Reader and ideally Adobe Acrobat. So if you don't have those applications, you will want to install them on your computer as well. But the SF424 is a fillable form, and as such, you would ideally complete it with Acrobat Reader. HUD will accept a form that is not filled out that way, but it's far easier to complete it in that fashion. And as I've tried to stress here, you will follow the instructions for the form that began on page 11 in regard to how to obtain the form. But then once you find the form, you want to turn the page and follow the instructions on pages 12 and 13 of the FY23 grant guide. It is that set of instructions that will steer you in the right direction. How so? It will help you to apply the more standard instructions for this community project funding grant award that you've received. And I also want to note that there are references to additional certifications and insurances related to box number 21, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, to correctly follow those specific instructions, you must possess 3 essential pieces of information. And these have been referenced actually in prior webinars. The first is the legal name of your organization. And I want to point out here, and I realize that this may be hard for you to see, but item 8 is referring to box 8, which relates to your applicant information. And there you want to enter the legal name of your organization, its unique entity identifier from SAMS.gov, and then the award information that is contained in the joint explanatory statement, which is part of the congressional record. Now, this will become clearer to you when we actually do an activity around this topic. But what is important is that you understand here that you want to use both these sets of instructions in conjunction with each other. And I'm going to now share with you that SF424 to kind of point out where you want to look back and forth at both the standard form and the specific instructions that appear in the center of your screen. I'm going to share now the SF424 and particularly draw to your attention what I referenced earlier. And it looks to me like you are seeing the SF424. Box 8 is the applicant information where you see the legal name, the UEI, and the address and your organizational unit. That is key. What is of secondary importance is item or box 15, which actually with this standard form refers to the descriptive title of the applicant's project. But the specific CPF instructions are more particular in this regard, and they ask you to, yes, refer to the title of the project as it appears in the Joint Explanatory Statement, the JES of the Congressional Record, and use that phrase or possibly just a single word that identifies the use of your grant funds, but then you want to begin to describe in summary form what that entails, and then attach supporting documents as specified in HUD's instructions. This refers to attach supporting documents as specified in agency instructions. And this is the point where you look past the standard form and look to the CPF grant guide, particularly pages 12 and 13. And then the last item I want to call attention to is box 21, where your authorized representative will make a statement of certifications and insurances, which essentially attest to the fact that everything is true and accurate in your submission. Okay, I will stop sharing this document and go back to the PowerPoint presentation. And Jennifer, I think it might be useful at this stage if I pause and see if there are any questions, particularly about the SF424, before I remove this item from the screen. Any questions on the SF424?
Sorry, I was on mute. No questions on the SF424, no.
Okay, good. I must have covered that information in sufficient detail.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, going back to the PowerPoint presentation, you see here again those specific instructions and the notation on this right-hand side about the additional certifications that I'm going to now elaborate on. They relate to box number 21 from the SF424, where the certifications appear. And those certifications cause you to provide related standard form 424 forms. In addition to completing that most common form, the SF424, you are expected to make further assurances that fit the type of project or program your community will undertake with its CPF funding. And this becomes a bit confusing. I'll try to help you become clear about the nuances here. Depending on the type of your project, you must download and complete either one or both of these related forms, which specifically cover certifications that are in addition to the standard assurances and certifications that I briefly summarized earlier. And you may obtain these forms, by the way, at that same grants.gov webpage. And as you see here, one of the forms relates to non-construction programs, and that is better understood if you first look at the second form, the SF424 assurances for construction programs. It's straightforward. The SF424D is if your grant is being used to construct a facility or housing or some other building, then you want to use that assurances form. But for everything else, you want to use the non-construction program form, the SF424B, and those assurances will cover every other kind of grant-assisted activity. The most common example would be public services. And if your grant funds are to be used for services to the community, then you would want to use the SF424B covering non-construction. I do want to point out that as a result of the nuances that surround the related forms, we do urge you to check with your grant officer if necessary to determine which forms apply. And also HUD is creating an enhanced tool to assist in the review of grant packages, and details are coming soon in regard to it. Among the features will be further guidance that help you and your grant officer figure out which of these forms or both of them might need to be submitted in addition to the SF 424. Okay, Jennifer, now we'll deliver the next set of slides, but we promised to stop and see if there are any questions. I paused earlier when I was still sharing my screen in regard to the SF 424. Are there any additional questions, Jennifer, or any that maybe you want to read aloud because they were frequently asked questions?
Yeah, so we have one question in the chat. It asks, what if we are buying a building and remodeling it? Is that considered construction?
And that may be a good example where the question probably needs to be referred to your grant officer. If the use of the funds is solely for the purchase, you have to keep in mind that this program is designed to complete a community project, and the expectation typically on HUD-funded community housing and community development grant projects is that you are not given funds just to buy up land. You are given funds to buy land for a particular purpose. And so I think it's probably more likely than not that you would need to include both forms. But I'll pause here and see if either Portia Smith or Connor LaRoe want to offer an answer to that question regarding acquisition.
Hey, this is Connor. I would also advise that the grantee contact their grant officer just to make sure that this wouldn't fall under construction. I don't imagine that it would. I mean, it sounds like and Laura sent a new message. We'll be buying a building and making it a food pantry. I suspect that it probably wouldn't be considered construction, but again, I would refer you to contact your grant officer. One thing I did want to mention is that for these certifications, you can fill out and do both just to make sure. I mean, those forms are not hard to fill out. It pretty much only requires a few things in your signature, and nothing bad will happen if your project is not doing construction and you fill out and submit the construction assurances. That won't negatively impact your grant package at all.
And what Connor just answered, which was different from my answer, is a reason why you do want to refer to the question to your grant officer, who is clear that in this instance, you're not just buying property, which could be an unimproved land, which was what I immediately began thinking about, but an existing building. And as he indicated, you know, if you're going to immediately place that building into service as a food pantry or as a homeless shelter, then that would change the circumstances. Any other questions, Jennifer?
Yes. Okay, they just clarified that they'll be buying a building and making it a food pantry.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
it.
Connor picked up that added bit of detail, which, as I indicated, changed the response to the answer.
Right. Yeah, but that was the only additional item in the chat.
Okay. Well, would you like to begin covering the other required forms?
Yeah. So there are two additional forms that you're going to need to fill out. We're going to talk a little bit about the checklist also, but in terms of forms themselves, there are just two others. One is the SFLLL. This is the disclosure of lobbying activities form. And the other is the SF 1199A, which is the direct deposit sign-up form. So we'll start with the disclosure of lobbying activities form. So this form is required by everyone. So even if your organization does not engage in any lobbying activities, you are required to fill out this form. So you want to make sure that you include this in your package. If it does not apply to you because your organization does not do lobbying, then in part 10 of the form, you're just going to note NA for not applicable. However, if you your organization does engage in lobbying, you're going to complete this form fully. If any funds other than your federally appropriated funds have been paid or will be paid to any person for influencing or attempting to influence an officer or employee of any agency, member of Congress, an officer or employee of Congress, or an employee of a member of Congress in connection with this federal grant. So in an abundance of caution, if your organization does any lobbying, just complete this form fully. If you do not do any lobbying at all, then you can go ahead and complete part 10 of this form as not applicable and then submit the form itself. So that is the SFLLL Disclosure of Lobbying Activities form. This form can be completed on a computer. So you can open it up in Adobe Acrobat and complete it electronically. There are specific instructions on this form on page 13 of the fiscal year 2023 CPF grant guide, which is linked in the chat. Somebody had asked for the link to that grant guide, so I did drop that link into the chat for everybody. So if you want to grab that guide, it's on page 13, you'll see more instructions on this disclosure of lobbying activities form. So our next form is the SF 1199A. This is the direct deposit form. So this is how funds will end up in your accounts. So we want to make sure that we're being very careful and completing this form accurately. To complete this form, the grantee will complete sections 1 and 2 of the form. The grantee's bank or financial institution will complete section 3 of the form. So again, the grantee completes sections 1 and 2. The bank completes section 3. So just keep in mind that you will need some outside help to complete this form fully before it's returned to HUD. You're going to note that at the bottom of this form, it says to mail the form to HUD, but that is not necessary. In fact, you shouldn't do that. You should include all of your forms together and send them all to your grant officer. So just note that note at the bottom of the form about mailing it, we don't have to do that. You're going to include this form with your other forms that you're submitting along with your materials. Again, the grant guide is a great place to get more instructions on all of the forms and all of the items that we've talked about in the cohort series. So page 19 is where you want to look for your instructions on the 1199A form. And you'll see at the bottom of the page 19 there that there are, there's a little box that walks you through the different sections of the form and explains what information goes into each box. On this form, you'll also see that there is the address for the government agency address. That's the HUD address and that's the address that you will use on any letter that a financial institution might need to provide. They'll use that address there. That was a question that came up in another session, which was how to address those letters. And the address is right there on the form. Again, this is a form that can be completed on your computer electronically using Adobe Acrobat. So you can go ahead, open this link to this form, and then complete it on your computer. Just a reminder, you're going to be completing sections 1 and 2 as the grantee, and then your financial institution completes section 3 of the form. Along with the form, it's going to ask you to include a voided check or a deposit slip to initiate your direct deposit. Note that if you do not have a voided check or deposit slip, this is where your bank can send a letter confirming the account information, and that's where you'll use that address that we talked about on the previous slide. You want to make sure you're verifying all the contents of this form. Obviously, it's really important that it's all accurate because this is how the money will get to your account. So make sure you're going to double check all of your materials, right? But you're going to pay careful attention to this one to make sure that you have all the numbers in the right places.
Jennifer,
Alright.
we do have a couple of questions regarding the forms you just went over. Do you want to pause and answer those?
Yes.
Okay,
So I see the one question relates to the forms and the submission of the forms, how the forms get
right.
submitted. So the forms, you're going to be putting together your narrative, your budget, all the pieces that we've talked about in earlier sessions of the cohort series, and you're going to be completing these forms, and you're going to submit this entire package to your grant officer. As of right now, that's the way the submissions should be processed. In the future, there will be ways to submit all of this information electronically through DRGR, but for right now, the submissions are being made by email to your grant officer.
And Jennifer, the only exception to that would be the banking information that is sent from the bank to HUD. That is handled separately, correct?
I
So
believe so.
I can clarify. So for the banking information, for verification for your banking information, you can either submit a voided check that has your organization's routing number and account number on it, or what you can do is you can have your bank write a letter saying that, you know, your organization has a account at that branch, and then the letter should state the routing number and account number that's associated on that deposit form.
Thank you, Connor. And while you're answering questions, we also have a question from a grantee in Maine who is wanting assistance in contacting her grant officer.
Sure.
And go ahead.
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah. So if you're having trouble getting in contact with your grant officer, what we recommend doing is reaching out to the HUD-X Ask a Question. So this is used primarily for programmatic questions that you have about your CPF program. You can use the portal at any time to ask a question. We're referring grantees that are having trouble getting in contact with their grant officer to send in an inquiry via this portal. These inquiries, if you're having trouble getting in contact with your grant officer, just make a note of that. And those questions will be directed to our office to then get in contact with your grant officer and let them know that you're trying to contact them. We're simply doing this just because it's an easier way to track these contact requests so that we can deal with them in an effective way. So I'm going to put the link to this in the chat or reply to your question. So yeah, we recommend doing that. And we get referred those questions pretty quickly. So we'll be able to let your grant officer know that you're trying to get in contact with them.
Thank you, Connor. Yes, what that represents is a way for you to escalate the question about who your grant officer is, or in the case that was raised in regard to the main grantee, getting in touch with that particular grant officer. And we will be providing you toward the end of this webinar a link to the complete list of grant officers and other contact information. So you maybe would want to look at that list to make sure you have the current email address for your grant officer, which of course can change over time. Okay, Jennifer, if there are no other questions, you can proceed with the grantee submission checklist.
Sounds great. So those are the two forms. Those are the two remaining forms that we have to talk about today. And that concludes the list of forms that you'll need to submit with your materials. However, we did want to talk about the grantee submission checklist. Remember, at the beginning in one of our first polls, we asked, when are folks planning to submit their materials? So that's the ultimate goal, right? Is to get all of these application materials submitted to HUD And so one thing that is available to you to make sure you're providing a quality submission to HUD is the grantee submission checklist. So the checklist is going to ensure that all of the applicable items that HUD is looking for have been gathered and covered in your submission. This is an optional document. It is not a document that you submit to HUD. It is really just a tool that you can use to make sure that you are submitting a quality submission. And so if you look at the screen here, there's a screenshot on this slide of the submission checklist. And you'll see on this submission checklist, it's just one page, and it's going to walk you through the different components of your submission. So this first one here, the grantee has an active registration on sam.gov. If your organization is not registered on sam.gov, you will need to do that before you submit your application materials. That hasn't come up in any other sessions where we talked about that, so I like to flag that one for folks. So make sure you're registered on sam.gov. You want to check that the legal name of the funding recipient on the SF-424 forms are the same as the entity named in the JES. Several times actually over the cohort series, we've had people ask what they do if the organizational name has changed. So you want to make sure that you are double checking that name, and if that name is different, you want to reach out to your grant officer. You also are going to look at the amount requested and make sure that it is the same amount listed in the JES. You want to make sure that the applicable SF-424 forms are completed properly, of course. This is why we're having the form session today, to make sure that you are aware of what forms are required and what goes on them. And then the same goes for the SF-LLL form. And of course, the direct deposit form. Now we get into components of your submission that are not related to the form. So these are related to items that we talked about in prior cohort sessions. So we have the project narratives. You want to make sure you're describing your entire project. You're indicating what specific activities you're going to undertake to fund with the CPF grant. If you want more information on what goes into the narrative, you can look in the grant guide, and you can also refer back to the cohort slides from the narrative session. All of those slides and the recordings should be available on the HUD Exchange at this point, I believe. I saw them all up there. So if you want to go back and even listen to the recording again, you can do that. The project budget, similarly, you can double check the cohort session or the grant guide to check your requirements for the budget, but we want to make sure that it is consistent with all of the applicable appropriation language, and that you're including everything that you need to include. And then finally, there's a little checklist here related to indirect costs. We talk about indirect costs in the budget session. So if you want to go back and look at that session for more information on indirect costs, you can do that. However, even in the budget session, we refer you to other resources. This can become quite fact specific. So you want to, you do have any follow-on questions to indirect costs, you can certainly reach out to your grant officer, or you can add them to the AAQ. We can also talk about some of them next week during office hours. So this is the checklist. That's what you're going to go through. You can find a copy of this checklist on page 41 of the grant guide. Again, this is not a form that you are completing. You can go to the next slide. However, it is available as a tool to you. So it's not fillable as an electronic form, but it's something that you can use to go down the list, print it out, use your Adobe highlighter, just make sure that you've checked off all the items. Again, you can refer to previous cohort sessions. I believe we're pretty well caught up on the HUD Exchange with slides and recordings. So you can access those there. And I will drop that link into the chat in just a moment. And then once you have all of your application materials collected and you verified that you're submitting everything as required based on this checklist, you can email your materials to your grant officer and to cpfgrants@hud.gov. Now it's time for a poll again. Oh, Randall, you're on mute.
Okay, yes, it is time for a poll. And I would like to set up an example that illustrates what a typical grantee would ideally do with the grantee submission checklist that Jennifer went over. First, the grantee's representatives would assemble all the necessary materials, as she noted, going down those listed in the checklist, determine that they are complete, and then thoughtfully check all the boxes submitting the grant application or that are required for submitting the grant application packet. But often a grantee might be unsure about certain of those items. And we want to take a particular example involving ABC housing services. And I'm going to ask Jennifer to drop into the chat a one-page document that represents that applicant's grant application, and I will be sharing my screen to go over the details related to that particular PDF file.
I am adding it now. Sorry, had a little bit of a technical glitch.
Okay, and can you, Jennifer, see ABC Supportive Housing Project?
I can see it, yeah.
Okay. This is simply a one-page description that is offered to you to enable this example to be used in the activity. It includes the name of the project, ABC Supportive Housing, and you can see the project number here and the fact that it is a fiscal year 23 community project funding grant. The state would be identified where these two X's appear, and then there'd be a unique grant number. And there is, of course, then key information, as Jennifer and I both stressed, about the project narrative. A key piece of information related to the Joint Explanatory Statement, or the JES, which expresses the intent of Congress for the use of your grant funds. And then there is the grantee submission checklist that presumably the representatives from ABC Housing have attempted to complete. And like I indicated, in what is often the case, they do have, they're uncertain about certain items that do appear on that checklist, and those items are highlighted. I'll go over them individually, but first let's become clear on what their project entails and what the narrative would say, beginning on the SF 424 box 15, which I shared with you earlier, where they would identify the title of the project as the ABC Supporting Housing Project, and then they proceed to describe their project and attach further details. This is a representation of what might be the entirety of the description. The ABC Supportive Housing Project will provide housing and services to residents with special needs. Residents will receive drug and alcohol rehabilitation services. And then the agency is also renovating an apartment building as part of the project, and it's expanding its operations with support from the United Way. The project, they write, is made possible in part by a $1 million CPF grant to ABC Housing Services Incorporated. That's it. And then we go on to the joint explanatory statement, the so-called JES, and this is actually a representation of what appears in the congressional record. It's not as detailed as you might think. There is a table that includes the project title and usually a phrase that gives a sense of what the intended use of funds is. The grantee's identity, the state where the award is to be used, and then the funding amount. And we see here that the JES, the intent of Congress, is for ABC Supportive Housing Services project to be funded with the $1 million grant that is shown here. And there are two other entries that we showed here, which kind of illustrate for you how brief the first column is. ABC Housing Services simply refers to services. Another project on this list in the same state is Bertram Gardens, referring to land acquisition. And still another is Capital City, which is a job placement program. But you're focusing your attention now on ABC Supportive Housing. And the representatives of ABC Housing Services, that nonprofit group, is completing the grantee submission checklist, trying to follow Jennifer's guidance. And they have checked off the boxes where you see the red check mark. But there are three issues around which they're uncertain. The first relates to the legal name of the funding recipient in the SF 424's Block 8. They want to make sure it's exactly the same as the entity named on the JES, or in what might be a technical correction of that act of Congress. And we'll say in this instance, that is not the case. There is just a JES, as I shared with you, appearing above here on this line that is highlighted. The second uncertain item relates to the SF 424's related forms. They know that they need to complete the SF 424, the application for federal assistance. But they're uncertain about the SF 424B. They note that this says if required, and it needs to be, of course, properly executed and dated, but they're uncertain that their service project would trigger the use of that form. They've also checked off, they think, well, we are renovating a building that we own, so there will be some construction involved, and they check that item off. But they're also then uncertain about whether their project narrative is sufficient. Does it describe the entire project and indicate the specific activities that will be financed or funded with the CPF grant in the amount of the $1 million, which the Congress says are to be used for services. But in this narrative, you see that there is a larger project described, and all we see in this last sentence is that the project is made possible in part by that $1 million CPF grant to ABC Housing Services Incorporated. So if you were in the position of the ABC Housing Inc.'s staff trying to complete this grantee submission checklist, what would you do? And that's the next.
Oh, you went to mute, Randall.
Okay, so we're going to go next to the poll question related to this, and I will try to share again the PowerPoint presentation. Looks like it is showing up. And there are the three questions which are indicated on the poll. Is our agency correctly named on all the legal documents? Is that form, the SF 424B assurances for non-construction, required? And then if you scroll down, you will see the third question, which is, do we describe the whole project in detail and the uses of the grant? And if you do have uncertainty about the information that I shared earlier in that one pager, just take a look at it in that PDF file to make a more informed choice of the answers of yes or no to these three poll questions. Jennifer, it looks like we have, is it 24 of 40 participants responding? So do we want to wait?
25, 26. We'll give everybody just a few more seconds if you'd like to participate in the activity, and then we'll end the poll to share the results.
Yeah, and I might help by going back to the preceding us. Well, I can't easily do that at this stage. Do
Okay,
you
so
have
go ahead
the one
and-
pager?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and end the poll and share the results.
Okay, it looks like in regard to the first question, most of you did indicate that the agency correctly names itself on all the grant materials and congressional record, the two main elements of their grantee submission packet. In regard to the second question, is that form the SF 424B, the assurances on non-construction, required for their housing service project? And you answered mostly yes. And then on the third question, does ABC Housing Services describe the whole project in detail and the uses of the grant? We'll stop sharing now, Jennifer, and I will advance the slide and share the correct answers with the participants. Okay, in the answer to the question, are you ready to submit? You all did correctly answer the first question, which asked, is our agency correctly named on all the legal documents, referring in particular to the SF 424, the joint explanatory statement from the congressional record, and our project narrative that would be attached as an additional item of information. And so the correct answer is yes, and they could check that item off as being complete. The second question about which they were uncertain is this form, the SF 424B, required? And that's the form for non-construction. And the answer to that question is yes. And the reason for that is that the use of their grant funds as specified by Congress is for services. And as such, that's considered to be a non-construction use of the grant. It would amount to essentially public services, the drug and alcohol rehabilitation services, which would trigger the use of that additional form. They had also checked off the SF 424D because they know they're renovating the apartment building, but they're not clear on how that activity in their project will be funded. And that leads to the third question. Do we describe the whole project and the uses of the grant? And the correct answer is no. The project narrative does not clearly describe the specific activities for which the CPF grant will be used. I'm going to go back now and share with you that one pager one more time, since we have a time available to us. What you see here in their description is that they indicate that the ABC Supportive Housing Project will provide housing and services to residents with special needs. Residents will receive drug and alcohol rehabilitation services. And that does correspond with the intent of Congress as expressed in the JES, which is to give them money for such services. But what they don't do is differentiate between that activity and the renovation of the apartment building and the expansion of operations in support with support from the United Way. All they indicate is that they're going to receive a $1 million CPF grant for ABC Housing Services Incorporated. The nonprofit group will receive that $1 million grant, but they are not, I'm scrolling down here now to that box. They don't describe the entire project and indicate the specific activities that will be financed with the CPF funds. What they have described in this brief narrative, and presumably with the title and the first part of this summary in the SF 424 box 8, is incomplete, and it does not identify the answer to that particular question. And as such, they are not ready to submit. Going back to the presentation, are they ready to submit? The answer is no. The grantee, ABC Housing Services, would only be ready to submit the application if their narrative clearly describes the specific activities for which the CPF grant will be used. So they need to describe the entire project in a clear fashion that aligns with the specific uses of the CPF grant, which per the JES is solely for the services, and then include a budget, as Jennifer had referenced earlier, with the sources and uses of both the grant itself, the $1 million CPF grant, and the other aspects of the project, the funding from the United Way for expanding their operation, and identify how they would pay for the renovation of the apartment building. Okay, Jennifer, before we leave the activity, it looks like there are 4 messages here. I've not seen what they relate to. Are there any clarifying questions about the activity and the correct answers?
I don't believe that there are questions about the activity. However, there are a couple questions about other things.
Okay.
Does anyone have questions about the activity? If you do, you can drop those into the chat. in the meantime, we can take a look at these other questions. So one of the questions relates to environmental review. So it's asking, is it preferred to submit the agreement with these forms before or after environmental review is completed? And I think, you know, with most things related to environmental review, you want to talk to your grant officer about the specifics of your situation. It's hard to answer some environmental review questions without looking more closely at the project, but if you want to provide some more specifics here, we can see what we can do, but probably your best bet is to talk to your grant officer.
Yes, and that's probably a theme that we want to emphasize here. You do want to check with your grant officer whenever in doubt. And in the event that there is an uncertainty as indicated by this incomplete grantee submission checklist, where you've highlighted, their representatives have highlighted the 3 questions, and maybe they were a bit uncertain about that 3rd question related to the way their grant project narrative aligns with the intended use of the grant according to the congressional records JES. You know, they would need to confer with their grant officer, and chances are that grant officer would say, well, your description needs to cover the entire project and indicate the specific activities that will be financed with the CPF grant funds. If there that $1 million is going to be used solely for the service delivery, and this is essentially a public services project, the drug and alcohol rehabilitation services, then that would enable you to figure out you know, how to answer that question accurately. You would also, you know, need to include the sources and uses budget, and your grant officer likely would say, I would request that you include, in addition to your project narrative, not only more detail, but also the added information that would appear on the budget that Jennifer described earlier. Thank you for your comment, Elijah, that it was a great exercise.
Great. Okay, and the next question relates to the lobbying disclosure form. They're asking specifically about questions 6 through 9 and how you complete that information. And I believe 6 through 9, blocks 6 through 9, the information that you want to put in block 6 is the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. For block 7, you want to put, I'm going to just for block 6 and 7. I'll copy it for all.
You want for me to share the SF424?
It's the LLL.
Oh, okay.
I'm just going to copy this into 6 through 9. Oops. I accidentally hit enter too quickly, but there you go. So you're going to put for block 6, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Block 7, you're going to include this code here for CPF. And then for block 8, it's going to be your grant and the grant amount. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yes.
All right. So no more questions. If no more questions, we can move on to the next section.
James says thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this is, as I mentioned earlier, this is our last cohort session. Thank you for being here with us through these this series. We hope that it helped you to understand exactly what needs to be collected for your materials and how to make a quality submission so that you can get as quick of an approval as possible. You can obtain all the webinar materials for these previous sessions on the HUD Exchange. I did earlier drop into the chat the link to the page on the HUD Exchange where you can access the previous slides and recordings. They do take about a week or two to get the recordings all transcribed, everything made 508 compliant, and then posted to the HUD Exchange. So this session, for example, will follow in a week or so. However, I think the previous sessions are all pretty much posted. So you can take a look at those there. And then the last session that we have for you all is an office hour session next week for forms. This is specifically to talk about forms and your questions that you might have on forms. So now that you've heard all of this information, you have an opportunity in the next week to go and start to complete those forms and apply what you've learned today. And then if you still have questions, come to office hours and ask those questions about forms. If you have other questions, you can certainly bring them and we'll do our best to get answers to you. But specifically, any forms questions will be great to bring next week. And that is on.
We do have a related question about the submission of the forms, and this will certainly be covered in the office hours session on March 26th. But is there a firm deadline for when everything needs to be submitted to your, the question says program officer. I think that intends to reference the grant officer.
Mm-hmm. I believe there's a deadline for, I believe, executing the grant agreement, but not necessarily a deadline for submitting your materials. And I can pull that up, but I'm sure that Portia or Connor have that date and on the tip of their brain.
Right.
But let me get that, because there was a question that came up in another session.
Yes, could either Connor, you or Portia answer that question?
Yeah, that's correct, Jennifer. And I'm sorry, I don't have the date off the top of my head. So maybe we can circle back on that and give you the exact date. But Jennifer's correct. There is a deadline by which grantees need to have a fully executed grant agreement. I believe it's between 2 and 3 years from the announcement. And grantees do also need to have their awards fully extended more years out than that. I think it's about 6 or 7 years out from that. But we don't have a firm deadline for 22 or FY23 grantees of when you have to actually submit the materials to your grant officer.
Yeah, and so I'm looking back at our previous session, and so what it says is, what it says is that your funds need to be expended, drawn down, and expended by the end of your grant term, which is 5 years, which would be the end of August 2031. And then that's for expenditure. However, for fiscal year 2023 awards, you need to be under your grant agreement by August of 2026. So that's when your grant agreement needs to be executed, but obviously you need to submit your materials in advance of that date so that it can be fully processed. Probably you don't want to wait that long, but that is the formal deadline for having your grant agreement executed. And then again, you need to have your funds fully expended by 2031. So those are the dates to keep in mind. I hope that helps.
I don't see any questions.
Yeah, no more questions. I don't see them either. So if you do have questions after this session, you can always reach out to Randall or I. Our emails are there on the screen at tdainc.org. And then you can also access someone through the cohorts at tdainc.org mailbox, which is the mailbox that has been corresponding with you throughout the cohort series. So you can always just pop an email back in a reply to one of those emails you've already received, and it will get routed to the right person. So you've seen this resources slide several times, but it doesn't hurt to remind you that you can access the grant officer assignments at the link that you see there. That is on the HUD.gov website. Most of what we've been talking about is the HUD Exchange, but that reference document actually lives at HUD.gov. The CPF program website on the HUD Exchange is where you're going to find all of the wonderful materials on guidance documents, recordings of the previous cohorts, new information that comes out on the program. So be sure to check back to that website frequently. That site does include the grant guide, which I have linked into the chat if you scroll up. And then your environmental officer contacts are listed there on the HUD Exchange. And that is also where you can access the Ask a Question desk. So moving forward, if you have any questions about CPF, you can submit them through the AAQ, and they will be answered by an expert or passed along to someone who can answer the question, but it's a great resource for ongoing questions that you might have. And then, of course, there are forthcoming guidance documents through the forms of desk guides. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And if you're signed up for that mailing list that Randall talked about at the beginning of the session, you will get an alert when new desk guides are made available. And then finally, as always, we want to get your feedback. So if you can, please complete the evaluation for this particular session. You can scan the QR code right there on the screen and get that started so that once we end the webinar, you can finish the survey. This survey link will still be emailed out to you through the Cohorts mailbox. So if you don't have your phone handy to scan that QR code, you'll have another opportunity to click the link in your email to answer the survey. And it is very helpful to us to understand what's worked for you and what you might like to know about in the future. And with that, I don't believe there are any other questions in the chat.
No.
So thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
Again, we have just the office hour session remaining, and that'll be on the 26th. So please join us then.
See you later.
Thanks all.